I was thinking earlier, usually when we talk about a major architectural project, right, there's this expectation of transparency.
Oh, sure. Like the big public reveals.
Exactly. You look at the glossy rendering of the new skyscraper and you see this beautiful glass facade reflecting the sunlight. You see perfectly manicured trees in the plaza.
Right, the happy people walking their dogs.
Yeah, it looks absolutely perfect, pristine.
Well, I mean, it's designed to look pristine. Those renderings are explicitly crafted to sell a vision, a vision of order and progress.
But then you actually walk onto the real construction site.
And it's a totally different story.
Completely. You see the cracked foundation. You see corners being cut on the structural steel or this chaotic scaffolding leaning dangerously over the sidewalk.
Yeah, the illusion breaks down pretty fast.
It really does.
Mm.
Suddenly, that glossy rendering feels a lot less like a promise of what's to come and a lot more like a deliberate sales pitch, like it's meant to distract you from the reality on the ground.
The stark contrast between the optical illusion and the actual physical structural reality.
And that contrast, I mean, that is exactly the theme jumping out of the massive stack of sources we're looking at today.
It really is the defining thread here.
We have economic reports, environmental impact analyses, labor market data, legal briefs, and they're all covering a profoundly busy week of executive actions, specifically from Friday, July 10 through Thursday, July 16th, 2026.
A very, very dense 7 days.
Unbelievably dense. So our mission for today's exploration is to look past those official press releases. We're looking past the televised speeches and those glossy political renderings, right?
Right. To examine the actual real-world structural consequences of the administration's actions over this week.
Because when you dig into the data and the legal analyses of this particular mid-July stretch, an undeniable pattern emerges from the documentation.
It's impossible to ignore once you see it.
Over and over, the administration presented its policies as protective. Protective of workers, protective of taxpayers, protective of national security.
But a closer structural examination of the mechanics behind these policies reveals something entirely different.
Tell me about it. What do the economists and legal scholars in our materials actually see?
Well, according to them, we see a consistent shifting of substantial risks, health, environmental, and constitutional risks, and they're being shifted directly onto the shoulders of ordinary working-class Americans.
While delivering what in return?
While delivering highly concentrated benefits to extractive industries, chemical manufacturers, and, quite frankly, executive power itself.
Wow. So we're going to break down the mechanics of how these specific executive orders, proclamations, and agency actions actually impact everyday life.
We were talking wages, health care, local tax burdens.
And basic civil liberties. So let's just jump right in. We can start by examining a policy that was framed specifically as providing relief to workers in domestic industries.
The July 13th environmental action.
Yes. On July 13th, the administration issued a proclamation regarding chemical pollution. They basically granted certain chemical plants a 2-year exemption from parts of the Environmental Protection Agency's hazardous organic national emission standards.
And to understand the gravity of that, we really have to look at what those standards actually are.
Right, because it sounds super bureaucratic, but it's actually life or death.
Exactly. The EPA framework we are talking about governs volatile organic compounds, VOCs, and highly toxic air pollutants, things like ethylene oxide and chloroprene.
What are those even used for?
They are heavily used in manufacturing plastics, sterilizing medical equipment, producing synthetic rubber, things we use every day.
And they are notoriously dangerous, right? I mean, the medical literature in our stack knows these are known carcinogens.
Highly carcinogenic. They are heavily linked to lymphoid cancers, breast cancer, and severe neurological and respiratory issues.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the EPA standards are designed to force these chemical plants to install specific, often expensive fence line monitoring technology.
Fence line monitoring. So what does that actually look like on the ground?
It means setting up continuous air quality sensors right along the property line of the facility. The goal is to ensure these invisible, odorless, toxic gases aren't just drifting into the surrounding neighborhoods.
Because if you can't smell it,
Yeah.
you don't know it's poisoning you.
Right. And if a leak is detected by these monitors, the company is legally required to find the source and repair it immediately.
Okay, so that's the safeguard. But the framing from the White House on July 13th was very urgent, almost panicked.
Right. They treated it like an impending crisis.
Their press release claimed that the technology required to monitor and control this pollution just isn't commercially available at scale right now.
Which is their justification for pausing it.
Yeah, and they said because of that, forcing these plants to comply rapidly would cause immediate shutdowns, which, they argued, would hurt the domestic supply chain for things like healthcare and agriculture and ultimately threaten national security.
So the official narrative presents an emergency intervention to save domestic manufacturing.
Exactly.
It frames the environmental regulation as an existential threat to the American worker.
Okay, if I'm trying to follow their logic here, I can hear people saying, well, look, if a plant shuts down, people lose their jobs. Isn't keeping the plant open inherently pro-worker?
It's a compelling argument on its face.
I mean, it sounds like taking the batteries out of a hypersensitive smoke detector so people can just keep cooking dinner without the alarm blaring, you know?
That analogy actually perfectly highlights the underlying danger that environmental economists point out in these reports.
How so?
Well, yes, you can keep cooking, but you've disabled the very thing designed to keep the house from burning down with everyone inside it.
Right. You're just ignoring the fire.
Exactly. The economic analyses we have push back really hard on this pro-worker equation. Does this proclamation preserve some industrial employment and domestic supply in the short term?
Probably, right.
Yeah, it likely prevents some abrupt closures for the time being. But the mechanism of what is actually happening is, at its core, a massive transfer of cost.
Okay, let's trace that cost shift. Where is the money moving? Who benefits and who pays?
By granting a 2-year exemption, the administration allows these chemical companies to bypass massive capital investments.
So they save a ton of money.
A ton. They don't have to purchase the expensive fence line monitors. They don't have to hire the specialized technicians to maintain them.
And they don't have to halt production to fix minor leaks.
Right. So they get immediate, tangible financial relief on their balance sheets. But, and this is the crucial part, the physics of the situation haven't changed.
The chemicals are still there.
The hazardous organic emissions continue under the older, much weaker standards.
Meaning the pollution is just still pouring into the air.
The pollution doesn't stop just because the monitoring requirement was paused. So the public health experts in our source material ask a very critical question.
Which is?
Who pays the cost of those emissions?
And I'm guessing it's not the executives in the boardroom.
No, it falls entirely on the workers breathing the air inside the plant and the communities living just beyond the fence line.
So the people who have absolutely no say in the corporate balance sheet are essentially subsidizing the company's savings with their own lungs.
That is exactly what the data suggests. The structural reality is that these costs are not measured in quarterly corporate profits. They are paid in human biology and personal finance.
The real-world impact. What does that actually look like for a family?
Health policy researchers document that it takes the form of higher rates of cancer diagnoses years down the line. It means increased childhood asthma. It means missed days of work because a parent has to stay home with a sick child.
And in the American healthcare system, when working-class families experience chronic illness, they face the very real threat of crushing medical debt.
Absolutely. One severe illness can wipe out a family's entire savings.
Not to mention the impact on their primary source of wealth.
You mean housing?
Yeah. If a neighborhood remains classified as a high pollution zone, property values stagnate or they just plummet.
Oh, completely.
So a family's equity is just drained because they happen to live downwind from a plant that was granted a compliance exemption.
Environmental justice advocates highlight exactly that point. When the administration calls this regulatory relief, that terminology completely obscures the fact that the risk wasn't eliminated at all.
It was just moved.
The financial burden of compliance was simply converted into a health risk and dumped onto the public.
Wow.
Benefiting an employer's profit margin does not automatically equate to protecting the worker's welfare.
Right, because if preserving a job significantly increases the worker's risk of developing a respiratory illness that will bankrupt their family.
Then the policy has prioritized the manufacturer over the working class, plain and simple.
And this strategy, providing short-term administrative relief that quietly shifts the long-term risk onto everyday people, it isn't isolated to environmental regulations, is it?
No, not at all. We see a nearly identical structural pattern in how the administration handled immigration policy just 3 days earlier.
Okay, let's get into that. On July 10th, the Department of Homeland Security took action regarding the Temporary Protected Status Program, or TPS.
Right, and TPS is a really critical piece of the broader immigration framework.
Can you break down what it actually is for us?
Sure. It was established by Congress in 1990 to provide legal status and work authorization to foreign nationals who are already inside the United States when extraordinary temporary conditions make it fundamentally unsafe for them to return to their home countries.
So we are talking about ongoing armed conflicts,
Yeah.
massive environmental disasters, things like that.
Exactly. Severe temporary crises.
So the July 10 action involved immigrants from Haiti, Ethiopia, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, South Sudan, and Myanmar.
Right.
Their legal authorization to live and work in the U.S. was right on the verge of expiring, and the administration issued extensions.
Which on paper sounds great.
Yeah. A press release announcing a TTS extension sounds like a lifeline. It sounds like it prevents this immediate administrative cliff where employers suddenly lose their legally authorized workforce overnight, and these families get to maintain their income.
But as always, the devil is in the mechanical details.
What did the labor economists and immigration attorneys in our stack of briefs point out?
They point out the shocking reality of these specific extensions. They were incredibly, almost impossibly limited in scope.
How limited are we talking?
Haitian work permits were extended only until July 24.
Wait, July 24th. That is exactly 2 weeks from the announcement.
Yes. And for the other 6 countries, their permits were extended for roughly 1 single week.
1 week.
Just 7 days.
If we look at the daily mechanics of being a working adult in America, how does a 1-week legal extension actually function in the real world?
It doesn't. It creates complete systemic paralysis. Labor advocates argue that a 1-week extension is not a durable policy at all. It essentially strips away basic economic stability.
Because you can't plan anything.
Think about the infrastructure of modern life. You cannot plan a family budget on a 7-day horizon.
You certainly can't sign a housing lease. I mean, no landlord is going to approve an application if your legal right to work and earn a paycheck expires next Friday.
Never. You cannot secure a car loan to get to your job. You cannot lock down reliable childcare.
Even simple things like renewing a driver's license,
Oh, that becomes a complete bureaucratic nightmare.
because the state DMV systems are programmed to tie the validity of your license to the expiration date of your federal immigration status.
Exactly. The computer literally won't let them issue a license past that 7-day mark.
And from the employer's side, it has to be a nightmare too.
It's chaos. If you are an HR manager using the federal E-Verify system, and the system tells you your employee's legal status expires in 7 days.
You are forced to prepare termination paperwork to comply with federal law.
Right, only to tear it up and do it all over again a week later if there's another tiny extension.
It weaponizes administrative anxiety.
That's a great way to put it. The reports analyzing this move suggest it postponed the disruption just enough to keep the industries humming for a few more days.
So they avoid a massive, sudden labor shortage that would look bad in the headlines.
Exactly. But it trapped the working class individuals in a state of perpetual manufactured panic.
They are legally authorized to work, but they are completely paralyzed economically.
Because no institution will engage in a long-term contract with someone living week to week.
It keeps people entirely off balance and compliant. And, this administration's approach of leveraging these vulnerabilities, shifting these massive burdens onto everyday people for short-term corporate or administrative gains, it doesn't stop at the immigration desk.
No, it extends directly into the physical geography of the country itself.
Into federally protected landscapes. Which brings us to the reshaping of the American map on July 13th.
The actions taken in Utah on that date represent a massive historic shift in land management policy.
The administration issued proclamations drastically reducing the size of 2 major national monuments, Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante.
The sheer scale of this reduction is just staggering when you look at the maps.
Yeah, Bears Ears alone was slashed by about 91%.
9%.
It went from roughly 1.36 million acres down to just over 120,000 acres. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of acres of canyons, plateaus, ancient cultural sites suddenly losing their federal monument protection with the stroke of a pen.
And the legal argument the administration deployed to justify this relies on their specific interpretation of the Antiquities Act of 1906.
The Teddy Roosevelt Law.
Right. This was the law originally signed by Roosevelt to stop the looting of Native American archaeological sites.
So how did they use a law meant to protect sites to shrink a monument?
The administration claimed that the boundaries set during the Biden administration were just far too expansive. They argued those boundaries exceeded the statutory requirement that monuments should only occupy, quote, the smallest area compatible with the proper care and management of the objects to be protected.
But they didn't just shrink the boundaries and leave the land alone as, say, a regular national forest, right?
No, not at all. The proclamations explicitly earmarked the newly excluded acreage for resource extraction.
They opened the door for claims on uranium, copper, silver, vanadium, zinc, lead, and molybdenum.
A massive opening for the mining industry.
And the public framing presented this as a massive boost to domestic resource independence and a huge win for local economies.
That was the core message: jobs and independence.
Now, if we look at the immediate economic data, the administration is promising mining and drilling jobs. And I have to say, for a working-class family living in that rural region of Utah, that sounds like a highly tangible, immediate benefit.
Oh, the resource extraction industry certainly presents it exactly that way.
So what's the catch?
Well, environmental economists and regional labor analysts urge us to look at the historical boom and bust cycle of these specific mineral markets.
It's never as simple as they make it sound.
Never. The economic reality of rural Utah isn't a simple binary of mining jobs versus no jobs. First of all, the potential extraction jobs rely entirely on the highly volatile global market viability of those minerals.
Meaning, a presidential proclamation opening the land does not guarantee a single shovel actually goes into the ground if the global price of uranium is depressed that year.
Precisely. So the promise of immediate local prosperity is heavily contingent on macroeconomic forces completely outside the local community's control.
Highly contingent.
And even if the geological surveys are favorable and extraction projects do proceed, labor data shows there is no guarantee those jobs remain local or unionized.
Really? Why wouldn't they hire locally?
Because modern mining is incredibly specialized. Often, multinational extraction firms bring in their own transient out-of-state crews for the specialized drilling and blasting phases.
Oh, so the local community might only see a temporary bump in, like service industry jobs, waitresses, hotel clerks.
Exactly. While the high-paying specialized jobs go to transient workers.
And then we have to account for the second-order costs, which the reports show are massive.
The long-term permanent costs fall squarely on the public ledger.
Let's talk about the environmental impact.
The environmental impact studies in our materials detail the irreversible destruction of Native American archaeological and cultural sites. We are talking about cliff dwellings and petroglyphs that have existed for thousands of years.
Which you can't just rebuild.
No. Furthermore, uranium and copper mining are incredibly water-intensive. They carry severe risks of water table degradation in a region that is already dealing with an arid climate.
And if the water table is polluted by toxic tailings, that destroys the agricultural capacity of the surrounding area for generations.
Right. And crucially, regional economists point out that you are trading away a long-lived, stable, and sustainable tourism and outdoor recreation economy.
People travel from all over the entire world to hike and camp in Bears Ears.
Yes, and that brings in steady, reliable revenue to local guides, hotels, and restaurants.
So you trade a sustainable economic engine for a temporary extraction boom that will inevitably bust.
And when it does bust, the historical precedent is brutally clear. Taxpayers are very often left holding the bag for the environmental cleanup liabilities.
Right, because the mining companies just declare bankruptcy or pack up and leave.
And the abandoned mines and toxic tailings become federal Superfund sites funded by the taxpayer?
So again, the structural mechanism here is a massive transfer of long-term risk and financial liability to the public in exchange for short-term corporate access.
It fits the pattern perfectly.
Yeah.
And legally, this entire maneuver is highly contested.
Let's get into the law, because shrinking a monument by 91% isn't just some minor administrative tweak.
No, it strikes at the very core of presidential power under the Constitution.
Constitutional scholars and tribal attorneys outline a really fascinating separation of powers dispute here.
The Antiquities Act of 1906 explicitly grants a president the power to establish a national monument to protect federal land.
It is a delegation of power from Congress to the executive.
Right. However, the statute does not expressly state that a president has the power to revoke or drastically reduce a monument established by a predecessor.
It gives the president the power to build the protective fence, but it doesn't give them the explicit power to tear it down.
Exactly. Tribal governments and conservation groups argue that under the Property Clause of the Constitution, Article 4, the ultimate power over federal lands belongs exclusively to Congress.
Therefore, only Congress can revoke or severely diminish a monument designation.
But the administration's legal counsel counters that the power to designate inherently includes the power to correct boundaries they deem overbroad.
But the timeline here is the real issue, isn't it? I mean, if they open the land up to mining claims right now, a mining company can secure the lease, Bring in the bulldozers and start blasting.
Yes.
Doesn't that render the slow-moving court case entirely irrelevant?
That is the exact strategy legal analysts are flagging in these briefs. The legal issue of whether a president can shrink a monument is completely unsettled in the courts.
But the real-world impact doesn't wait for the Supreme Court.
No, it doesn't. The danger highlighted by conservationists is that the mining infrastructure, the new access roads, the drill pads, the heavy machinery could cause irreversible damage to fragile ecosystems and ancient cultural sites before a federal judge ever issues a ruling on the legality of the 91% reduction.
You can't unbulldoze a 2,000-year-old cliff dwelling.
Once the damage is done, a court ruling 3 years later saying the reduction was illegal doesn't magically put the landscape back together.
It's a strategy of establishing facts on the ground to outpace the judicial clock.
Exactly. And this strategy of pushing forward massive, irreversible consequences before democratic or judicial checks can intervene, it is not limited to domestic land disputes.
No, it's not. We see the exact same strategy of exploiting legal gray areas and timeline mechanics applied to international military interventions and global trade.
Which takes us right to the geopolitical arena on July 13 and 14.
We have two major international actions to unpack here, and they both have massive implications for the cost of living and the safety of American citizens. Let's start with the economic threat, the Strait of Hormuz shipping fee.
This was a wild 2 days.
For anyone not deeply steeped in global logistics, the Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most vital maritime choke points. It sits between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
A massive percentage of the entire global oil supply and liquid natural gas passes through this very narrow waterway.
Right. So on July 13, the administration publicly floated the idea of imposing a 20% fee on all cargo moving through the strait.
And then, just as suddenly, the president abandoned the proposal the very next day.
They cited discussions with Gulf governments and stated they would pursue investment agreements instead.
It's a complete whiplash policy maneuver.
It's the equivalent of threatening to drop a massive toll booth right in the middle of the world's busiest commercial highway, panicking all the freight operators, freezing up global logistics networks, and then just yanking the toll booth away 24 hours later.
And supply chain analysts and macroeconomists look at this incident not as a harmless change of mind, but as a deeply destabilizing event.
Why? I mean, they took it back.
To understand the danger, we have to look at how global maritime shipping and insurance markets actually function. If a 20% fee is slapped on cargo and energy moving through that strait, that cost is not going to be absorbed by foreign governments or multinational shipping conglomerate.
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
I'm tracking the logistics here. The shipping company doesn't just eat that 20% toll.
Never.
They instantly contact their insurers. And then the maritime insurance markets, places like Lloyd's of London, react by drastically raising the war risk premiums for any vessel entering the Gulf. Then the shipping company passes that new massive premium on to the distributor. And by the time that cargo container reaches a port, the price tag has already baked in that geopolitical threat.
The economic models show that a fee like that cascades through nearly every single supply chain on Earth. Because energy costs dictate transportation costs, the price of literally everything goes up.
So that 20% fee would ultimately be paid by the listener.
It manifests as a massive regressive tax on the American working class.
You would feel it in skyrocketing prices at the grocery store because the diesel fuel for the delivery trucks is suddenly more expensive. You would feel it directly at the gas pump. You would feel it buying manufactured goods that rely on petroleum-based plastics.
So it's a foreign policy maneuver that instantly acts as an inflation bomb on domestic consumers.
From fully materializing.
But the economic briefs argue we can't just brush it off because it didn't happen this time.
Right, the damage to stability is already done.
The very fact that such a sweeping, disruptive fee was floated so casually demonstrates a highly volatile approach to policymaking around one of the world's most sensitive strategic choke points.
And markets hate volatility.
Commodity markets price in instability. When the threat of sudden unilateral tariffs or fees becomes normalized, insurers and suppliers keep their risk premiums elevated just in case.
That volatility inherently threatens working-class budgets because the prices stay high.
Exactly. And this theme of unilateral, unstable policymaking perfectly tees up the other major international action from this week.
which constitutional scholars highlight as potentially the most consequential of all.
Without a doubt.
Between July 10 and July 13, the administration engaged in aggressive maneuvering regarding the Iran war powers clock.
The legal architecture of the situation is deeply, deeply concerning to experts on separation of powers.
Let's lay out what happened. The administration formally notified Congress that, quote, renewed hostilities with Iran had begun on July 7.
Now, according to the legal analysis in our materials, the administration considers this notice as the beginning of a brand new 60-day period.
A period during which they can conduct military operations without getting new congressional approval.
Right. To understand the mechanics of this, we need to dive into the history and function of the War Powers Resolution.
Let's do it.
The constitutional tension here dates all the way back to the founding. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, only Congress has the power to declare war.
The legislative branch holds the purse strings and the power to initiate sustained conflict.
However, under Article 2, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Historically, presidents have argued they need the flexibility to respond immediately to sudden attacks without waiting for a congressional debate.
Because if we're under attack, we can't wait weeks for a Senate vote.
Right, which led to the War Powers Resolution in 1973. It was passed by Congress, overriding Richard Nixon's veto in the aftermath of the Vietnam War.
The 1973 resolution was an attempt to balance these powers, right?
Exactly. It acknowledges that a president might need to act quickly in an emergency. So it allows the president a 60-day window to engage in unilateral military action without prior congressional authorization.
But the critical mechanism is the time limit.
After 60 days, the president must terminate the use of armed forces unless Congress formally votes to approve the action or declare war.
It's a strict 60-day ticking clock designed to force democratic accountability.
But legal scholars point out the massive loophole the administration is attempting to exploit here.
How does the loophole work?
Well, the administration had previously informed Congress that an earlier round of hostilities with Iran had been terminated. Now, by declaring that a conflict ended, and then declaring that renewed hostilities started on a specific date, July 7th, the administration is treating this as a completely separate, isolated episode.
Wait, so they're attempting to reset the timer back to zero?
Yes. They are attempting to turn a strict statutory 60-day limit into an infinitely renewable presidential war authorization. The legal briefs emphasize that if a president can just declare the war paused on day 59 and then hit unpause the next week for a fresh 60-day window, they have effectively hollowed out the entire statute and completely bypassed Congress.
You've completely removed the democratic process from the act of waging war.
Completely. And the policy analysts urge us to look at the real-world working-class impact of this constitutional maneuvering because it is profound.
An escalating unauthorized military conflict isn't just an abstract debate for constitutional scholars in Washington. It has immediate material consequences.
Huge consequences.
It means massive increases in federal defense spending, which either balloons the national deficit or forces severe cuts to domestic programs like infrastructure and education.
And it guarantees global fuel shocks, which we just established acts as a direct, painful tax on the working class.
And most critically, military advocates remind us who actually fights these conflicts.
The physical and emotional burden of combat service falls overwhelmingly, disproportionately on working class enlisted military families.
These are real people whose lives, whose limbs, whose mental health, and whose family stability are being put on the line. The deployment cycles tear families apart. They strain the already underfunded VA system.
And this legal maneuvering over the war powers clock means these service members are being sent into a sustained, escalating conflict without a democratic vote by their elected representatives.
The president is unilaterally resetting the clock on their lives.
It represents the ultimate centralization of executive power. It removes the most consequential decision a nation can make, sending its citizens into combat from the legislative branch entirely.
And this strategy of bypassing the legislature to unilaterally engineer outcomes through administrative loopholes, it is perfectly mirrored in the administration's domestic policy approach.
Which brings us back home to the domestic regulatory changes.
Specifically, the hidden tax of ambiguity found in the new immigration rules. On July 16th, the administration announced the revival of a broader public charge rule, which was scheduled to take effect on September 18.
Essentially, this rule allows immigration officers to deny green cards or visa applications if they conclude that an applicant might become dependent on public assistance at some point in the future.
Now, the concept of a public charge actually dates back to the Immigration Act of 1882, right?
It does, but how it is defined in practice makes all the difference in the world.
The administration's framing for this 2026 revival is that immigrants should be entirely self-supporting. They argue that this rule is a necessary common-sense measure to protect American taxpayers from footing the bill for new arrivals.
And if we look at that framing purely at face value, wanting new arrivals to be self-sufficient sounds like a reasonable goal, especially to local taxpayers who are worried about county budgets being overwhelmed.
Right. So why do the healthcare economists and immigration advocates in our sources argue that this specific rule is so structurally damaging in practice?
The damage comes down entirely to how the rule is engineered administratively.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Previous guidance, like the rules established in 1999, provided a definitive, concrete list of disqualifying programs. There was a clear, bright-line rule.
So you knew exactly what was allowed and what wasn't.
Exactly. It essentially said, if you use long-term institutional care or direct cash assistance like welfare, you may be disqualified. But if you use non-cash health and nutrition benefits, you are fine. It was completely predictable.
But this new rule discards the bright line.
Entirely. The new rule does not provide a definitive checklist. Instead, immigration officers are instructed to make individualized, predictive judgments about a person's future earning potential using a highly vague totality of circumstances test.
Totality of circumstances. What does that even mean?
They look at age, health, family status, assets, and education.
Which means the decision is completely subjective. It depends on the specific immigration officer sitting across the desk from you that day.
The legal analyses argue that in practice, this functions as a wealth test for legal immigration. But the sheer cruelty and the massive ripple effect on local economies is found in the psychological mechanism of ambiguity.
Because if the rule is vague, and you don't know exactly which minor use of a public service might eventually disqualify you or get you deported, you become terrified to use anything at all.
The chilling effect of this ambiguity is thoroughly documented in public health research. It extends far, far beyond the actual number of green cards that will be formally denied by an officer.
Think about mixed-status families.
Yes, exactly.
These are households where maybe the parents are undocumented or applying for a green card, but the children were born in the United States and are therefore U.S. citizens.
Under this vague totality of circumstances test, these families become completely terrified to interact with any government system whatsoever.
Even if those U.S. citizen children legally qualify for the help, even if the programs are entirely funded and available.
Especially then. Public health officials report seeing families actively withdrawing from Medicaid. They see mothers turning down food assistance like SNAP or WIC.
Wow.
They see families refusing housing support and even skipping basic routine medical care and vaccinations for their citizen children.
Just out of fear.
They do this because they are paralyzed by the fear that somewhere down the line, a local caseworker's note will end up in a federal immigration officer's file. And under the vague totality circumstances, it will be used to deny a visa or trigger a deportation.
And this is exactly where the economic analyses show the administration's claim about protecting taxpayers completely falling apart.
It shatters when you look at the macro-level healthcare economics. Let's trace the actual cost shift here.
Okay, let's follow the money.
By using fear and regulatory ambiguity to scare families away from preventative care and basic nutrition, the federal government might technically save a few dollars on its balance sheet for those specific federal programs.
But those federal savings don't erase the underlying human need.
No, they just shift the massive compounding costs onto local communities and local taxpayers.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that uncompensated care scenario. How does a local community actually pay for a federal immigration rule?
Well, imagine a mother who is too afraid to take her child to a free neighborhood clinic for a basic, cheap asthma inhaler because she fears the public charge rule.
The child's asthma doesn't magically disappear. It worsens.
Exactly. Eventually, the child has a severe, life-threatening asthma attack in the middle of the night. The mother has absolutely no choice but to rush to the local county hospital emergency room.
And under a 1986 federal law called EMTALA, the emergency room is legally required to stabilize the child, regardless of their ability to pay or their immigration status.
Right, but the family has no insurance because they dropped Medicaid and they have no money to pay the massive ER bill.
So that bill becomes uncompensated care.
Hospital administrators document massive spikes in uncompensated emergency room care, when these chilling effects take hold.
And the hospital has to make up that deficit somehow.
To cover those multi-million-dollar deficits, local hospitals are forced to either cut services for everyone, closing maternity wards or trauma centers, or they raise prices for all other insured patients.
Furthermore, local county governments often have to raise property taxes to bail out the municipal hospital systems.
So the local taxpayer is subsidizing the federal government's policy, and it goes beyond just the hospital.
We see spikes in preventable, communicable illnesses tearing through communities because vaccination rates drop.
We see spikes in workplace absenteeism because parents have to stay home with sick kids who didn't get preventative care.
We see food insecurity directly impacting cognitive development in local public schools, which requires more special education resources.
The federal government points to a spreadsheet and says, look, we saved the taxpayer money. Well, the local hospitals, the local public schools, and the local county budgets bear the catastrophic financial brunt of the fallout.
It's an incredible shell game of liability.
It really is, and legally, the brief suggests this rule is on incredibly shaky ground.
What are the legal challenges looking like?
Administrative law experts predict massive legal challenges. Opponents argue the rule violates statutes regarding unconstrained agency discretion. They argue that the vagueness makes it impossible for individuals to follow the law, and that it is inherently discriminatory against working-class immigrants.
But again, much like the monument reductions in Utah, until the federal courts issue an injunction, the chilling effect is immediate, and the damage to local public health infrastructure is done.
The damage doesn't wait for the courts.
Let's just take a breath and look at the sheer scope of the week we've just analyzed.
It's a lot to take in.
We have executive actions that increase cancer risks for working-class neighborhoods by pausing pollution rules. We have threats to global supply chains that could spike inflation at the grocery store.
We have an administration trying to unilaterally restart a war clock to bypass Congress.
And we have an intentionally ambiguous immigration rule that shifts massive emergency healthcare costs onto local county taxpayers.
All in 7 days.
After a week of structural policy changes with such heavy real-world consequences, how does the administration choose to wrap things up?
By attempting to completely control the media narrative and distract the public's attention.
Which brings us to the events of July 16th, focusing on narrative control and the First Amendment.
This is a wild pivot for them.
On that day, the exact same day the public charge rule was quietly announced, the administration utilized a nationally televised primetime address. And the topic of this major speech wasn't the potential conflict with Iran. It wasn't the inflation risks in the Strait of Hormuz.
No, the speech was centered entirely on the 2020 election.
The platform was used to push the Save America Act, which is a legislative package of proposed voting restrictions ahead of the November midterm elections.
But media analysts note that the core of the address was dedicated to repeating claims about the 2020 election, specifically alleging widespread foreign interference and systemic issues with voting machines.
And looking at the source materials, the legal and intelligence reviews, we have to impartially report the facts as established by the record here.
The administration's stated goal for this primetime address was election security.
However, it is a matter of extensive public record that multiple independent audits, dozens of court proceedings, comprehensive intelligence community reviews, and even senior officials from the first administration have repeatedly rejected the conclusion that foreign actors altered vote totals or that systemic fraud changed the 2020 result.
And the analyses note that there was absolutely no new evidence offered during this speech.
Which leads political scientists to analyze the functional utility of the speech. If a primetime address is not presenting new evidence or addressing immediate national crises, what is its actual purpose?
The analyses suggest the real-world impact is psychological conditioning.
How so?
By repeatedly broadcasting these claims from the highest office, the administration is conditioning voters to automatically distrust the integrity of any future election result that they don't like or that is unfavorable to the administration.
And from a purely strategic standpoint, media critics point out that the timing is impossible to ignore.
Oh, the timing is everything.
A primetime spectacle focused on grievances from 2020 effectively redirected the entire public's attention and the news cycle's attention away from the unauthorized military maneuvering with Iran.
It pulled focus completely away from the rising cost of living and the public health risks of the EPA rollbacks.
It functions as high-level political theater, acting as a massive smokescreen for the substantive structural policy changes we've been discussing.
But the attempt at narrative control didn't stop with the speech itself.
No. It extended aggressively into how the speech was broadcast and how the administration reacted to the free press. Which brings us to a deeply concerning First Amendment issue.
Right, because the major broadcast networks, specifically ABC and NBC, made an editorial decision regarding the July 16 address.
They declined to carry this election speech live on their main national broadcast networks.
And in response, on that same day, the administration publicly stated that those networks should lose their broadcast licenses.
Legal scholars highlight this as a profound, textbook First Amendment legal flag.
To understand why, we have to look at how the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, actually operates.
Let's break down the licensing structure, because it reveals how empty yet how dangerous the threat actually is.
The legal reality under the Communications Act of 1934 is that broadcast networks are not common carriers. They are not legally required to air presidential political speeches just because the president asks them to.
They possess editorial independence protected by the First Amendment.
Furthermore, the FCC does not license national networks like ABC or NBC as single, monolithic entities.
The FCC licenses the individual local affiliate stations in each city. The station in Omaha, the station in Denver.
Correct. So threatening to revoke the network's license demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding or a deliberate misrepresentation of how broadcast regulation actually works.
But more importantly, threatening to punish a media outlet using federal regulatory power simply because the administration dislikes an editorial decision. That is the very definition of viewpoint-based retaliation.
One FCC commissioner even went on the record to publicly describe the threat as unconstitutional.
But here's the structural question. The statement itself didn't actually revoke a license that day. No television stations went to static.
Right.
So if the threat is legally dubious and logistically impossible to execute with a single pen stroke, does it actually matter? Is it just hot air?
Media advocates argue it matters immensely because of the coercive regulatory pressure it creates.
Explain that.
Think about the massive corporate structures behind these networks. The administration appoints the leadership of the regulatory agencies, the FCC, the FTC, the DOJ.
The agencies that review multi-billion-dollar media mergers, corporate ownership transfers, and eventually the routine renewal of those hundreds of local station licenses.
It's the implicit threat of administrative warfare. When the administration casually floats the threat of revoking licenses, it exerts massive invisible pressure on corporate media boards.
The message sent to media executives is clear. Fall in line, air the speeches, adopt a favorable editorial stance, or your next critical business merger might get mysteriously tied up in regulatory red tape and antitrust investigations for years.
The real-world impact of that regulatory chill is that it slowly degrades the independence of the press.
It incentivizes self-censorship in newsrooms right before a national election.
It is the normalization of executive power being wielded as a bludgeon to pressure private, independent journalistic entities into becoming state megaphones.
It is a systemic degradation of institutional checks and balances. It is truly staggering when you look at the sheer density of it all laid out like this.
It really is.
Which brings us to synthesizing the week of July 10th through July 16th, 2026. We've covered a massive amount of ground today.
A lot of ground.
From the hazardous emissions at the fence lines of chemical plants to the uranium deposits beneath the Red Rock Canyons of Utah.
From the uncompensated emergency room bills driven by the public charge rule to the war powers clock ticking in the Middle East.
And when you synthesize all these disparate actions together, a highly unified picture emerges from the sources.
The defining question you have to ask about any of these policies is not whether they have some plausible benefit on paper. Almost every policy does.
Pausing an EPA regulation undeniably benefits a corporate balance sheet.
Shrinking a national monument undeniably benefits a mining company's access.
The real question, the only structural question that actually matters when evaluating these actions, is who gets that concentrated benefit and who is forced to bear the hidden cost.
The reports repeatedly show the administration conflating corporate production and the expansion of unilateral executive power with worker welfare.
And the analyses demand that we break that false association.
Benefiting an employer by letting them pollute the local air supply is not protecting the working class. It is poisoning them.
Expanding presidential authority to bypass Congress on military action is not protecting military families. It is endangering them without democratic consent.
We have to stop accepting the glossy architectural rendering at face value, and we have to start relentlessly inspecting the cracked foundation of the policies themselves.
Which leaves us with a final overarching pattern to consider from these reports.
I want you to think about how this administration, over the course of just 7 days, attempted to normalize the complete redefinition of time itself as a tool of control.
Redefining time, how so?
Look at the mechanical tools they deployed. They attempted to unilaterally reset a strict 60-day statutory war clock over and over again, treating time as an infinitely renewable loop rather than a firm democratic limit, entirely to avoid the constitutional requirement of congressional approval.
And simultaneously, they compress time for the most vulnerable.
Exactly. They extended a person's livelihood and legal status for those TPS workers a mere 7 days at a time. They use time as a weapon to maintain total leverage and keep workers in a state of constant, paralyzing anxiety.
They stretch time out infinitely when it serves to expand their own executive power. But they compress time down to the exact suffocating second when it comes to the legal rights of the workforce.
And the provocative reality to consider is how that normalization fundamentally changes a society's relationship with the future.
It destroys it.
When federal policy forces everyday people, whether it's immigrants navigating week-to-week visas, military families waiting on unauthorized deployment clocks, or fence-line communities waiting for the cancer clusters to appear to live in a state of manufactured perpetual instability, planning for the future becomes functionally impossible.
And when ordinary people are completely consumed by the sheer instability of surviving tomorrow, sustaining long-term democratic accountability for the people in power becomes almost impossible to achieve.
It really does.
Well, you know what they say, the glossy rendering always looks perfect until you have to actually live inside the building. Thank you for joining us for today's analysis. We will see you next time.